Coal country's been sitting in damp creek bottoms for 200 years, surrounded by something that's been quietly cleaning water the whole time, and nobody told you. There's a length of grapevine hanging on a fence post behind my spring house right now. Cut it the right way, stick one end in a jar of the dirtiest water you can find, and by supper time the water dripping out the other end is clean enough to drink. My grandfather's people came up out of the hollows of West Virginia, and this is something they carried with them out of the mountains. Vine, a piece of wood, no filter you buy, no pump, no electricity, no chemical. Just a stick that's been growing on every fence row in coal country your whole life, doing a job nobody ever told you it could do. How is that possible? A piece of wood pulling bacteria clean out of swamp water. I'm going to show you exactly how, and I'm going to tell you why this sat right under everyone's nose for 2 centuries while companies sold water filters for $40 a piece. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll never look at a grapevine the same way again. Let's talk about what most folks do when they're worried about their water. They drive to the store, they buy a pitcher filter, the kind with the cartridge you swap out every 2 or 3 months, somewhere around $15 to $20 a cartridge. Over a year, that's $60, $80, more if you've got a family drinking through it fast. Over 10 years, that's pushing $1,000 just for the privilege of having clean water come out of your own tap. And that's if your water's already decent. Folks on well water who get a bad test, who find coliform bacteria after a flood, after a dry summer when the well runs low and pulls in runoff, those folks are looking at boil water advisories, bottled water by the case, sometimes a whole new filtration system installed by a contractor running $800 to $2,000. Now here's where the story gets uncomfortable. None of that was ever necessary if you had a fence row with a grapevine on it. I spent a good while this spring tracking down where this knowledge actually came from, because I wanted to know if this was just something passed around or if there was real science behind it. What I found was a study out of MIT published in 2014, where researchers took ordinary pine sapwood, the same kind of wood that's in any pine branch you'd cut off a tree in your own yard, and used it as a water filter. They ran contaminated water through a small section of that wood and tested what came out the other side. The bacteria, the dye particles, everything that was supposed to be too small to stop, got stopped. The wood did it. Not a cartridge, not a chemical, the wood itself. That study sat in an engineering journal. It got a little attention, a few articles, and then it went quiet. Because here's the thing about a piece of pine branch or a grapevine cutting. Nobody can sell it to you. Nobody can put a brand name on a fence row. There's no monthly subscription for a vine. So why does it work? I want to explain this the way my grandfather would have, because the explanation is simple, and once you hear it, you'll wonder why nobody ever told you growing up. Every living vine and every tree has a system inside it called xylem. Think of it like a bundle of straws running up through the wood, except these straws aren't open all the way through. Each one is made of a chain of tiny cells, like rooms connected by little doorways. Those doorways are called pores, and they're so small you couldn't see them with your naked eye in 100 years. The whole job of that system, when the plant is alive and growing, is to pull water up from the roots in the dirty ground through all those tiny connected rooms, all the way up to the leaves at the top. And along the way, anything bigger than those tiny doorways, dirt, bacteria, anything floating in that groundwater, it gets stuck, it can't fit through. The tree's been filtering its own water its whole life. That's just how it drinks. So when you cut a piece of that vine or that branch the right way, and you keep that same flow going, dirty water going in where the roots used to be, clean water coming out where the growth tip was, you're not doing anything unnatural. You're just using the plant's own plumbing after it's been cut, the same way it worked when it was still in the ground. Now here's the part that should make you a little angry, even though I'm not going to be angry about it, because anger doesn't fix anything. Think about who benefits from you not knowing this. The bottled water industry in this country does tens of billions of dollars a year in sales. The home filtration industry, the cartridges, the pitchers, the undersink systems, that's billions more. Every single one of those companies needs you to believe that clean water is something complicated, something that requires their product, their cartridge, their replacement schedule. A grapevine cutting that costs you nothing and works for free doesn't fit anywhere in that business. There's no shelf space for go cut a vine off your fence. And it's not that anyone sat in a room and decided to bury this. It's quieter than that. It's that nobody who could profit from it ever had a reason to teach it. And everybody who already knew it, the old families, the mountain folks who grew up with a spring house and a creek and no money for store-bought anything, they just kept doing it quietly because it worked, and nobody ever asked them. I held on to that thought for a while because I wanted to actually test this myself before I told you about it, not just take somebody's word. So here's what I did, and here's what I want you to do, because this is your weekend project, and it costs you nothing but a pocket knife and a little patience. You're looking for a grapevine. Wild grapevine grows along fence rows, in the edges of woods, climbing up into trees, all through coal country and most of the eastern half of this country. You want a live one, healthy green underneath the bark when you nick it, not dead or dried out. A piece about 1 foot to 1.5 feet long is plenty. A cypress branch works on the same principle if you've got access to one, though I'll tell you honestly, I only ran the lab test on the grapevine, so that's the one I can speak to with certainty. Here's the trick, and this is the part that separates somebody who gets this working and somebody who tries it and gives up confused. A vine grows in a direction. Water moves up from the root end toward the tip, toward the new growth, the leaves. You have to keep that orientation. The end of your cutting that was closer to the ground, the root end, that's your dirty water end. The end that was higher up toward the new growth, that's your clean water end. If you flip it backwards, it won't work near as well because you're asking that one-way plumbing to run the wrong direction. So when you cut your piece, take a minute and look at it. Which way was it growing? Mark the root end if you need to, a little notch with your knife so you don't lose track. Now strip the bark off, all the way around, the whole length of the piece. You can do this with a knife. Just peel it back like you're whittling. Underneath that bark is the wood you're after, pale, a little damp to the touch if it's fresh cut. Here's the part you cannot skip. The moment you cut that vine, especially the root end, it starts trying to seal itself shut. The plant doesn't know it's been cut for a filter, it just knows air got into its plumbing, and its natural reaction is to plug those tiny pores so it doesn't lose water. This is called cavitation, and if you let that root end sit out in the air for even a few minutes, it'll seal up and your filter won't flow right or won't flow at all. So the moment you make that cut, get that root end into water. Have your jar of dirty water ready before you ever cut the vine. Cut it and immediately push the root end down into that jar. Don't wait. Don't set it down to go find your knife sharpener. Have everything ready first. Once the root end is submerged in your jar of dirty, swampy, contaminated-looking water, take the other end, the tip end, and run it down into a clean collection jar. You'll want the dirty jar sitting up a bit higher than the clean jar, because what you're setting up is essentially a siphon, gravity helping to pull that water through the wood from the dirty side to the clean side. And then you wait. Give it a few hours. You'll see drips start to form on the clean end and fall into your collection jar. It's slow. This isn't a kitchen faucet, but slow and steady is exactly what you want, because the slower the water moves through those tiny cell-to-cell pores, the more thoroughly everything gets strained out. While that's working, let me tell you what I actually did to check this, because I wanted proof, not just a good feeling. I took water from a stagnant spot, the kind of water you'd never drink, swampy, sitting still, exactly the kind of water that grows bacteria. I had that water tested. The result came back at 43.6 mpn for E. coli. For folks who don't know what that number means, MPN stands for most probable number. It's how labs estimate how much bacteria is actually living in a water sample. A number like 43.6 means that water is genuinely contaminated, not borderline, contaminated. Then I took that same swamp water, ran it through a piece of grapevine cut and set up exactly the way I just walked you through, and had the water that dripped out the clean end tested the same way, less than 1, undetected. That's not a little better. That's the difference between water a lab calls unsafe and water a lab calls clean. A piece of vine off a fence row took swamp water from 43.6 down to nothing they could even detect. I sat with that result for a long time after I got it back, because I kept thinking about every flood, every drought, every well that ran dry or ran dirty in the hollows over the last 100 years, and how many families had something growing right outside their door that could have helped, and either knew it and never said much about it outside the family, or had it forgotten somewhere along the way when the world started telling everybody that clean water comes from a store. Now, I want to be straight with you, because that's how I do things. This is not a permanent system. You're not building a whole house filter out of a vine. This is for the emergency, the gap, the moment when your water's questionable and you need something better while you figure out your next step, or boil water if you can. One cutting will give you a few hours of dripping, and then the wood dries out and you'd want a fresh piece. That's it. You cut another one. It costs you nothing and takes 5 minutes, and a healthy fence row of wild grape has more material on it than you could ever use up. For your own setup at home, here's how I'd lay it out. Keep a jar of clean water nearby that's separate from your test, that's just common sense. You don't want to mix anything up. Cut your vine piece, 1 foot to 1.5 feet, strip the bark, get that root end into your contaminated source water immediately. Set the tip end into your clean jar lower down so gravity does the work, and let it run for a few hours. If you've got a real concern about your water, a flood, a well that's acted up, this gives you a way to get some drinkable water working while you sort out whatever bigger fix you need. And here's something worth thinking about for those of you with a little land. If you've got wild grapevine growing somewhere you don't mind it spreading a little, you basically have a standing emergency water filter growing on your property for free, renewing itself every year, needing nothing from you but a knife when you need it. I want to leave you with this. There's a whole world of knowledge like this that sat quiet in the hollows and the fence rows for generations. Not because anybody hid it on purpose, but because it never made anybody any money, so it never got taught in school, never got put on a label, never got a commercial. The families that knew it just knew it, the way you know which way the wind blows before a storm. And it's still out there. The vine is still growing on the fence row. The pine is still growing in the yard. The knowledge didn't go anywhere. We just stopped asking the people who had it. Tell me in the comments, do you have wild grapevine on your property right now? Have you ever heard of anyone in your family using something like this? I read every one of these, and if your grandparents or great-grandparents had a trick like this for water, I want to hear it, because there's more of this out there than any one person could ever track down alone. Next time, I want to show you something my grandmother kept in a crock by the back door, a way of keeping milk and butter fresh for days with no icebox at all, using nothing but a wet cloth and the shade of the spring house. It's the same kind of thing, something that was always there, working quietly, while everybody else went and bought something to do the job instead. Until then, keep an eye on that fence row, and remember, the people who built this country with their hands knew things we are only just starting to remember.